Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome back to the shop. Now this is going to be a little bit different. I did a video last week where we actually went through and talked through how do you identify wood. And I had a whole segment at the end. I wanted to go through all of the pieces of wood on my bench and talk through them and compare and contrast and talk about some other woods and how those fit into what I have as samples. But that would have ended up making the video somewhere around 30 minutes long, so I really didn't want to push it into that. But I thought I would actually take that footage and create another video with that here today. So we're going to go back through and look at all of the different scraps that were on the bench and talk through the specifics on them. So I hope this helps you out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So let's dive into that footage.
So this is red oak. Particularly, I do not know what type of red oak is this. Matt just told me it was red oak. I am assuming it is a pin oak, but I could be very wrong. It's not normal for pin oak to be quite this big. You can see when it's cleaned, it has a fairly white texture, but as it gets finished, this will turn slightly more red. The rays in here are not that big. It's relatively hard. I can scratch it slightly, but not that much. Very closely related, we have white oak. It is a relatively similar color. When you hold them up closely, often white oak appears to be a little bit more white and red oak appears to be a little bit more red. But don't trust that, because there are some white oaks that look very red and there are some red oaks that look very white. The best way to tell is the medullary array. When you quarter saw cut them, this medullary array comes out and becomes very, very apparent. Oh, that's so big, that is not red oak. So let's move on to another ring porous wood. This is very, very light, and ash and hickory look very similar. You can tell the big difference between ash and hickory is incredibly hard. You cannot get your fingernail into hickory. Ash actually feels a lot like oak. It has a very, very similar hardness to oak, whereas hickory is incredibly hard. This is going to tell you something very different when you plane it, because this is very difficult to push through, but yet it's ring porous and the curls look very similar to these two. When these are stained, you can get a hickory to look almost identical to red oak. It's hard to make a hickory look like white oak because the hickory rays are tiny. They're much, much smaller than even on red oak. So that's one of the big differences between them. Other than hickory is, well, it's hickory, it's incredibly hard. Here's another example of white oak, and you can tell this is a lot more brown. And the grain is also rather wild. This is a fairly common thing for white oak. Unless you buy specifically straight grain wood, you're going to see a lot of this rising and falling grain that comes with white oak. So now let's move on to walnut. Both of these pieces are walnut. And walnut is well known for its dark color here. And particularly this is a black walnut, which is very common around here. English walnut is similar. English walnut's a little bit lighter. Peruvian walnut tends to be a little darker than black walnut. But you'll often get this really, really light sapwood on here. And you're not going to see this as much from your big lumber yards, because they are going to steam this out, or they're going to cut off the sapwood, because most people just want this dark wood. I personally like that flavor going between the two. So here you can tell the difference. These are actually from the exact same tree, but this is a rough sawn and slightly stained from the sunlight, whereas this has been recently planed and is much lighter. Going back to the oaks again, this is live oak. It is just one of those woods that you can see, it almost gives you that look of starry, starry night with the grain just swirling around in it. It is an incredibly fun piece. This actually came from Tally Ho when I was out working on his shop. So this is a block made from the same pieces that his boat is made from. Okay, now we got our maples out here. This is hard maple. In particular, you have these lines in here. This is called ambrosia maple. There is a bug that gets in here and will actually stain the wood. But most of the time, it's just this light color running through here. Incredibly hard, incredibly smooth, diffuse porous wood. Hard maple is, well, it's very, very hard. Reminds you of hickory, but because it's diffuse porous, it gives you a much smoother curl. You tend to have the curls coming off as a solid string, as opposed to being stringy and fractured. The red maple is a softer maple. Looks very similar in actuality, though these have been stained a little bit more. The red maple does turn a little bit more brown in the sunlight, whereas hard maple stays a little bit lighter over time. They feel very similar in the plane, except for the softer maple works a little bit easier, and if you really work your fingernail into it, you can actually get down into that. Box elder, one of my favorite woods. It is a maple, and so it is very smooth like your hard maple, but it is a much, much softer wood. So for hand tools, this works really, really well. And anytime you see these bright red flames flames that's very common in your fire maples, or in this case your box elder. It is a soft maple. Really fun stuff to work with. Now we're on to our cherries. I wish I had a better piece to show you this. Cherry has this natural brown texture to it, and it can change wildly in color. It can be as light as the maple, or it can be as dark as this chop. This is actually the very same piece that this is. This is actually cut out of down here. So once it's been oiled and has been sitting around for a while, this will actually turn from this into this. So cherry can have a broad range of colors, but you'll know it because it has a very smooth texture. It's a very easy wood to work with. For hand tools, there are few woods that are as easy and fun to work with as cherry. It's just a pleasure to work with. For a softer hardwood, this is poplar. And most poplar you're going to see is this very, very light color here. But I like getting this stuff that has all of these other colors in this, from the greens into the reds. It just has such a variety. It is a diffuse porous wood, so it is very easy to work with, gives a nice smooth curls. But it is a very, very soft wood. It is even softer than the box elder. This planes incredibly easily. So if you want to practice wood, poplar is a great hand tool practice wood. Speaking of softwood, let's actually get into some real softwood. This is southern yellow pine, which is one of those good standbys wood. It tends to be very smooth. You can often get it without the knots in it that you get in a lot of other things. Fairly similar to Douglas fir, is a relatively hard softwood. Incredibly easy to work with, but pine is a little bit more stringy. So sometimes it can be a bit of an issue if your blade isn't incredibly sharp. This here is Douglas fir. It is a very old piece of Douglas fir, so you can see how the color changes on it over time. Douglas fir by itself actually looks fairly similar to southern yellow pine. Unless they're labeled, it's most of the time very hard to tell the difference. But this stuff has been so aged and darkened that it has a very different color and texture than what it originally would have. So next, let's get on to some of these exotics. I just have a few little pieces because every now and then I keep these and I hold on to them. This is zebra wood, which is a small scrap I have left over from a project. And there are many different types of zebra wood. I don't know which type particularly this is, but they all tend to look very similar. On the rings, rather than having pores and no pores, they're actually dark line, light line, dark line, light line, so they actually end up looking like, well, a zebra. This is a piece of ipe, an incredibly hard wood. Commonly it will replace teak. I actually got this as a scrap from the SV Seeker channel when I was down there helping him build his boat. He had a bunch of scraps he let me take. And so I've been using these occasionally. Incredibly hard, incredibly dense, weather resistant. It is diffuse porous, so you think it would run very easily, but it almost planes like a palm, and that it is very stringy when you plane it, but that's because it is so hard and there's so much silicon content in this that it's a pain to work with. Then Padauk, we're often going to be coming across this, an incredibly red wood, very similar to like a yellow heart and things like that. It's well, it's one of those woods that you just get to know with anytime you get to play with it. When you cut it, it has a very bright red sawdust. I would have a bigger piece than that, but that's all I've got left from my years of using this board that I originally got. And then you've got some other woods like this. This is actually a piece of ebony. I have a couple scraps that were given to me like this that I like to pull out every now and then when I need a little inlay. Ebony is kind of like African blackwood, except for you cannot see any grain in it. This is just an incredibly smooth, diffuse porous wood, incredibly hard, incredibly dense, and one of those fun ones if you ever get the chance to play with. It's interesting. Very, very difficult to play with, but really fun.
I hope you like this bonus footage. I wasn't planning on putting this out, but I thought, let's go ahead and do this. So it's a Monday video, which I don't put out very often, and I hope you like that. If you did, please let me know down below. If there's something else you'd like to see, or if you'd like this to be expanded in some way, let me know that as well. I'd love to be able to hear those. So I think that's about it for today, and until next time, have a wonderful day. Would you please hit that like button? Otherwise, I'm going to be bored.